welcome to another Action for Happiness event. It's wonderful to see so many of you joining us from all around the world, and I'm really delighted to be welcoming both Jinpa and Alex with us this evening. Jinpa, it's lovely to see you again.
Nice to see you. It's a real joy to be able to be with you again. Yeah.
And Alex, thanks for being here too.
Oh, yeah, it's really touching to see all the people that are arriving and all these different names. So shout out to, Uzbekistan and Nova Scotia, who most recently popped up on the list. But beautiful that so many people want to come together and talk about this subject.
And for anyone who is new to an Action for Happiness event, a very, very warm welcome. For those of you who've been part of this community for some time, you may well know Alex, who's been at the heart of the Action for Happiness team for many, many years, supporting all of our amazing volunteers who are running courses and groups, and is really been living the Action for Happiness mission with great passion and conviction for many years. So delighted to have you as part of this event, Alex. And Jinpa, we've done some wonderful events together before, always really lovely to connect with you. For anyone who's not come across Jinpa's work before, he's the founder of the Compassion Institute, a non-profit based in California. He's also been a translator and advisor to His Holiness the Dalai Lama for many years, and is a world expert on compassion and particularly how we can put it into practice. So Jinpa, thanks for coming back to another one of our events.
Thank you so much. It's a real joy. I fondly remember my visits to London and the events that you hosted, and I'm aware that today is in fact the 6th anniversary of His Holiness the Dalai Lama's last event in person. In those good old days, we remember when we can actually meet up in person, that a major event that your organization hosted. And I would like to take this opportunity right at the beginning to express my deep appreciation to you and your team, including Lord Laird, for really creating an amazing community, and not only creating a community, but also putting the word action in there, so that people who are sort of interested in cultivating themselves will never forget that in the end, that whatever cultivation that we do must manifest in the form of an action that is beneficial in the world. So you have really created an amazing community. And like Alex, I was looking at the screen and all these popping up from places all over the world, and it seems to be a truly global community as well, so which is deeply inspiring and encouraging. And
thank you, Jinpa. That's really lovely of you to say. And yes, you're right, it was 6 years ago that His Holiness was with us in London, and today's also a special day because it's World Peace Day, which seems very fitting with our theme, and also World Gratitude Day. And I'm sure in thinking about compassion and courage, the theme for this evening's event, we might touch a little bit on peace, world peace, and some of the challenges to it, and indeed on gratitude as well. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Just in terms of the audience, we're going to have a dialogue together with me asking questions to Jinpa and Alex on this theme for about half an hour or so. And then along the way, there'll be a chance for you to get involved on the chat. So as always, let's keep the chat kind and friendly and supportive and relevant to what's being discussed. And we'll invite you to share some specific feedback as we go along. And then there'll be a chance for you to put your own questions to Jinpa and Alex. So please do use the Q&A function. And if you see someone else's question that you would like to have answered, please do upvote their question so we can see which ones are most relevant to all of you. But again, thanks for being here. And I guess I would like to invite, to set the scene maybe, Jinpa, would you perhaps lead us in a short intention setting exercise so we can begin with a compassionate attitude?
Thank you, Mark. So at the beginning, I would like to invite all of us to just be grounded so that we can be fully present in this virtual hall that is global, and not just our physical presence, but also mentally and spiritually as well. And as much as possible, try to find a kind of a more settled energy, slowing down your body as you sit, as well as slowing down your breathing, and which facilitates the settling of your mind as well. And I would like to invite all of us to connect to what actually brought us all here together at this very moment, to be part of a conversation. And that is that we all care about the world. We all care about sufferings of others, not just of our own. And we all care about making this world, this place, a little kinder, compassionate, more equitable for all of us, not just ourselves or our own country, but for everyone. Let's acknowledge this beautiful and precious part of who we are as human beings, this ability to care for something beyond ourselves, something beyond our own small family. And let's celebrate it. And if you can, let's make the thought that as much as possible, I will live my life from this place. I will relate to others in my life from this space. And in fact, I will see the world and relate to the world from this place, this beautiful, precious quality that is natural to all of us as human beings. This capacity to care beyond our own selves. Let's just rest quietly with that thought. Thank you.
Jinpa, thank you. That was a lovely way to set us off on this journey together this evening. I wondered if we might go from that to perhaps exploring this term compassion that we, I think quite rightly, want to see and hear so often. Maybe we could just explore what that means and why we feel it's so important. How would you answer that?
Well, I generally explain compassion to be a very natural human quality, and which arises naturally in response, particularly when we are confronted with someone in suffering or is in need. So it's not something that we have to learn. It's a very natural human response. And it's something that is very universal, very deeply, and in scientific language, it's biologically inherited as part of our social creature, nature of social animal. But when compassion arises, although it seems like at the same time, but actually at least three important things are happening. One is that we are noticing someone suffering and need. So that's the cognitive part, which requires sometimes paying attention. And then the second part is we are emotionally responding to that situation. We are moved by it. So that's an emotional response. And third, there is a more motivational action orientation, wanting to see the situation change, wanting to do something yourself if you can. And so you have a cognitive, an emotional, and motivational part. And they all happen very quickly. But that is really coming from our own, to use the Buddhist language, nature as a sentient creature, one who has a natural capacity to experience pain and pleasure, and to be able to recognize the same shared nature in another being. So that, in a nutshell, is what I would call compassion.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Alex, what kind of emerges for you when you hear that?
A huge amount of appreciation to be here is still kind of overwhelming me. And yeah, also, I think I need to acknowledge the compassion that's been shown to me today by my mum and my girlfriend, who are both downstairs. The reality is that, as Jinpa mentions, that although these are kind of innate qualities within us, compassion is quite conditional. And there are often things that can kind of trip us up or get in the way. And for me today, kind of knowing that I'm coming onto a public talk, it's the first time I've been in a space like this. I'm alongside someone who, well, two people I hugely admire. It's amazing how much that constricted me into a space of self-focus and a sort of tightness. And it's interesting how dedicated my family have been in helping to soften that and broaden that back out. So yeah, I suppose this is something that I've been very fortunate for the last year to be studying at CCARE, the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research at Stanford that Jinpa is very closely related to. And I think one of the real takeaways from me was shifting from kind of seeing compassion as something that's, quite muscle-like and something I need to develop, and into something that does naturally arise, but only when conditions are really taken care for. Conditions like the intention to be compassionate, the awareness of other people, the sensitivity to the feelings going on in others and in myself. So for me, mindfulness practice has actually been really helpful in being a kind of foundation for developing more compassion.
Thank you both. And why don't we just turn to the audience while we're sort of introducing the theme. So an invitation to anyone who would like to share on the chat. When you hear the word compassion, what comes into your mind? Let's just share some of the sort of responses to compassion that are in this community. And I'll look forward to seeing those. So kindness, love, open heart, empathy, thoughtfulness, care for others, feeling for others, understanding, humanness, thinking of Mother Teresa, connection, pausing, acceptance, solidarity, sense of warmth, wanting to help, caring, feeling in others' needs, acceptance, warm-heartedness. What a lovely list, and many, many more, which I can hardly keep up with. How do you feel, Jinpa, as you see that list flying past?
That's beautiful, and also I'm impressed by the speed with which you're able to read all of this. I think this is the indication of how compassion is a very natural quality, that when we start paying attention, normally, quite often in contemporary society, we don't pay conscious attention to it. We just take it for granted. But with a conversation like this, which then gives us an opportunity to pay conscious attention to, and once you start looking at it, then you begin to recognize qualities of warmth, acceptance, non-judgment, approaching instead of avoiding, and tenderness of heart, and all of this, and consideration of the other. It's compassion is more about orientation towards others, and even in the case of self-compassion, it's a relationship issue. It's a relationship to oneself. So, once people start paying attention, then you notice all these different attributes that come up, and as Alex pointed out, that compassion, although is natural, but we need to create space for it, especially in a more challenging situation. Then we need to pay conscious attention to create the space. Just because it's natural doesn't mean it's going to show up. And this is one area where I think a little bit of humility to ourselves is very helpful, because particularly in the West, in the wake of Enlightenment thinking, there's been a fair bit of, I would say, kind of hubris about human beings, like rational creatures. We understand, we make choice rationally. The fact is, human beings are very complex. We have many competing forces in us. We may have the best intention, but we can't show up with that intention in any given situation, in some specific given situation. So with these competing forces within us, choice has to be made on our part. At the heat of a challenge, it's very difficult to make a conscious choice because we are kind of confronted by immediate urgency. But by setting the intention, we can start priming ourselves so that when the challenging situation comes, we will be able to remember. And that's why Alex's point about mindfulness practice is helpful, because mindfulness training and practice allow us to bring self-awareness. And when awareness shows up, then we have a chance of bringing the intention. Because if awareness doesn't show up, even if we have the highest and best values, in that moment, because there's no awareness, we're not going to be able to bring it. So I think it's really wonderful to know that people can immediately recognize, what they feel in themselves. But also, it's important to recognize that there are many other forces that can come in the way.
Just love to hear any reactions, Alex, you had to some of the words that emerged there. What were they resonating with you?
Yeah, very much so. I think the last thought that popped up for me was remembering something that was shared with me by one of my spiritual teachers in the sort of Thich Nhat Hanh tradition. But this idea of remembering is easy, but remembering to remember is hard. So they're trying to cultivate ways that we can be not only to set the intention, but also to create triggers that kind of remind us of that intention, and how we, I guess this is where it goes from a technique into a practice, is how we can start to cultivate over time a new set of kind of conditional responses, how we relate to suffering or accusation or blame. I'm so aware of how, obstacles for me around compassion are how quickly someone else's suffering can become my own victimhood. How all of a sudden the focus kind of shifts away, and I have kind of started to, take on and want to become defensive around the suffering that someone else is actually trying to share with me, which may indeed have been caused by me in some part. And so starting to build up this kind of set of intentions and to practice kind of coming back to a moment of pause, and to build that capacity for awareness, the spaciousness that Jinpa brought in so beautifully, I think is really critical, actually, and quite accessible too. It's something we can start to practice, and it can have a big effect quite quickly.
Now, one word that was mentioned by a few people in the chat was empathy. And sometimes compassion and empathy get used interchangeably, Jinpa, but is there a difference?
So this is one area where contemporary science is really helping a lot. Until recently, if you look at literature, like I'm a great admirer of literature, just novels and stuff, because for me, storytelling and narrative are really powerful ways of communicating human nature. We tend to use the word empathy and compassion kind of interchangeably without much, thought about the distinction. But in Buddhist thought, a distinction has been made. Not so much the word empathy is used. There is another term that is used. I'm not going to go into technical kind of distinctions, but in principle, a distinction has been made between emotion and a kind of a motivational component, which compassion brings. So there were two doctors who recently wrote a major book on compassion in healthcare. And it's called Compassionomics, and they came up with a slogan, which is little I suppose, kind of rough, but which I think captures a key point. They say empathy is emotion, compassion is action. So I think that distinction between empathy as an emotion and compassion involving some kind of motivational component has been there in Buddhism. But what modern science has done is to look at the two at the level of the brain's response. And now with Tanya Singer and her colleagues and many other researchers that followed up on an earlier work done by Nancy Eisenberg, has beginning to really map out in terms of neuroscientific language, the different brain systems that gets activated when you are just in empathy versus when you switch on to compassion. And the key difference in a nutshell is when compassion kicks in, the more action orientation areas of the brain gets activated too. So there is a wanting to do something. And from a kind of a theoretical point of view, I would also say the distinction is when empathy, you are in empathy zone, the focus is primarily the problem and the need and the suffering. When compassion arises, I think the focus also includes wanting to see a solution, wanting to do something, and looking for an action to do something. So one could say that compassion is a healthy outlet for empathy, because empathy is an emotion. And if you're just stuck in empathy for a long time, it can be exhausting, because like even the most exhilarating, positive emotional experience, it's too exhausting if you stay there for too long, because emotions are not meant to be enduring. They are meant to be fleeting. They're meant to be powerful signals the brain is showing us, saying, hey, pay attention, something important is happening to you. So, so empathy, compassion really provides a beautiful outlet for empathy, which, if it is true, then it has huge implications, particularly for those whose day-to-day profession involves constant exposure to others' pain and suffering. And how do you regulate that?
Well, that's actually a really, really great link through to someone I know who puts a huge amount of effort into action in a compassionate way, but also wrestles with many of the challenges and we face in terms of human suffering. And that is Alex and all your work with this movement. And we talked a bit there with Jinpa about the sort of the theoretical constructs and the science, but actually I think your personal journey here could be really interesting to hear about and to share. Perhaps you'd like to let us know a bit about the journey you've been on with compassion.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I'm going to touch on this point about the empathy compassion distinction, and I really loved what Jinpa brought in about the sort of motivational structures and the kind of brain structures that kind of transform the experiential element. Actually, I think one of the things that I've become aware of is this. You mentioned Tanya Singer, and she wrote a fantastic paper that was challenging this idea of compassion fatigue. There was this sort of misnomer that was bounded around for quite some time, and she used this same kind of analysis of brain patterns to show that, in fact, what we call compassion fatigue is much better termed empathic distress fatigue. And exactly as Jinpa was saying, this kind of empathy is so. So I'm pausing here because I'm feeling myself going into kind of theory, and what I'm really trying to say is that I've noticed how in my own life this sense of kind of caring about others can be hugely fatiguing. In fact, this idea I mentioned before of kind of how I can become a victim in response to someone else's suffering, this is partly a manifestation of my own care, but it's where that kind of empathic response sort of overloads me, and then it's trying to find some kind of route out. And Jinpa mentioned this idea of compassion being a more healthy route out. And I think this is really important because in the work I've been doing, where I've been having a lot of one-to-one conversations with people about their understanding of compassion and its relation to global challenges and suffering and social change, I really noticed that that a lot of people think of themselves as very compassionate, and no doubt they are, but what they really are is extremely empathic. And what I really hope is that more and more people can learn and understand this distinction and begin to practice, because when we start to bring in this set of both kind of conscious awareness, I think empathy can often happen subconsciously, whereas compassion seems to only really happen when there's some level of awareness there and direction and orientation. We start to practice that more and more, it can be hugely relieving. And Mark's invited me to share a bit of my story. So in tiny brief, I've been really exploring recently why I carry so much weight on my shoulders. And I've been dealing with kind of chronic fatigue for a very long time, and I've explored the nutritional and various other kind of well-being aspects. It's a great advantage to work for Action for Happiness, where I get to spend years learning about what supports our well-being. But one of the things that I got tuned into recently actually was in fact provoked by you, Jinpa. There's going to be various fanboy moments throughout this, so I hope you can prepare to accept that. But Jinpa actually mentioned a phrase during an event you did for us, one of our supporter circle dinners, which I'd never heard before, but it was the term moral injury. And it was a really transformative moment for me to come across this phrase, because it allowed me to start to reflect back into my life and my childhood. And, I've been lucky to have grown up in an extremely loving environment, but also an environment that has experienced a certain amount of challenge and suffering, from, the departure of my dad when I was very young, to kind of leave our family, and financial struggles, various aspects that have led me to have a certain sensitivity to injustice, to inequality, to difficulty in the world. And my questioning and kind of intellectual nature has led to me constantly asking kind of why is the world like this? Now, what I realize is that because of this kind of compound effect of not knowing the difference between empathy and compassion, being extremely empathic towards the suffering in the world, and also feeling and knowing that there's a lot of things that I would perceive to be wrong, that I would say that these are unethical systems, unethical ways of behaving, and unethical decisions that are taking place around us, that actually I've been carrying the weight, the unprocessed weight of all of that stacked on top of itself for many, many years. And I think this was really life-changing, actually, for me to start to get a grip on, and not just in a kind of great, I found a problem. I do like solving problems, so that helped even on itself. But to know that actually things I'd already begun practicing within Action for Happiness and within my Buddhist communities around cultivating more awareness, more tenderness to myself, more tenderness to the world, more sense of connection, actually that this might help me to start to shift how I relate to this kind of burden that I'm carrying. That's extremely exciting. It feels like I've found a way to turn trash into rocket fuel. Because all of a sudden this great burden of suffering can now be a kind of store of fuel for compassion, which is, as a state, is a wonderfully open, wonderfully rich with energy, wonderfully proactive state. It's the antithesis of feeling weighed down and fatigued. It's hugely inspiring, motivating, and meaningful. So I'm really at the very beginning baby steps of this journey. And I feel really inspired to make this a kind of lifelong practice and something that I explore. But I'm particularly excited about how spreading these kinds of ideas to more and more people. I think I'm probably not the only person who's come onto this call, as an empathic person, but with a kind of sense of burden in relation to global suffering, who might be interested in finding more wise and positive ways to relate to and deal with that, which aren't just about, the way that our society currently tells us to deal with this suffering, which is to block it out, ignore it, distract from it, find different ways to kind of escape. So,
well, Alex, I can confirm that there are indeed many people on this call who share that feeling, because I can see in the comments how many are saying this is really resonating with them. So thank you. In a moment, I'd love to turn back to the community and ask all of you another related question. But Jinpa, how do you feel hearing what Alex has just shared?
I deeply admire the clarity with which, and also authenticity with which Alex has shared his own journey. One thing that is very powerful is how one's own personal experience of suffering opens up. And it reminds me of the 7th century or 8th century Buddhist teacher Shantideva, who was hugely influential in the Tibetan tradition on the teachings on compassion and ethics. He talks about the paradox of Buddhists aspiring for the world to have end of suffering. But the fact is that suffering has, one's own suffering has a lot of, qualities. For example, he says that when you experience suffering, it brings a degree of humility because you begin to recognize your own vulnerability. He also says that because of your own personal experience of suffering, you become more empathetic because you understand other people's suffering. And thirdly, he says that because of your own suffering, the chances are you're going to cause less suffering on others. So those are really powerful. And, thank you for sharing this deep experience. But one thing that I would really like to kind of, throw in is that because of this distinction between empathy and compassion, I noticed that sometimes there is a tendency to give empathy a bad press. That I think is a mistake, because empathy is a beautiful human quality. And I, for one, believe that without empathy, at least for us mortals, I don't think there is a route to compassion. If you're not moved by someone's suffering, if you can't emotionally connect with someone's suffering, compassion is not going to show up. So what we are asking is a kind of a healthy regulation of that beautiful quality that allows you to connect with someone's suffering. So it's not so much empathy is bad, compassion is good, but it's basically saying that we need to find a way to positively and constructively regulate that beautiful human quality, and so that we don't switch off, because often, as Alex pointed out, that in contemporary society we choose to distract ourselves, and in fact in the scientific studies in the scanner, they see people literally avert their gaze when exposed to scenes of suffering, and that's generally how we at some point we can't handle it. So what is a healthy response is to not switch off empathic response, but switch it on, but then find a way to turn it into compassion, so that it becomes not exhausting. And this is particularly important for those many of us. I mean, I'm in my early 60s, which means that many of the people that I care are, the senior generation are in their 80s, which means, like my in-laws, there's a lot of ongoing support that you need to provide. And so in these kind of situation, if you switch off empathy, it's not helpful. But your exposure to others' pain and suffering is going to be prolonged. It's not a one-off event. So which means, if we can find a healthy response, a healthy habit of keeping the empathy and then finding a way to regulate it by being compassionate. And that way we don't get burnout. Because one of the 3 factors for burnout, and this research is coming primarily from the healthcare sector, which is where, especially in North America, burnout is a major crisis in healthcare among physicians. So one of the factors is emotional exhaustion. And emotional exhaustion, empathic distress, unregulated empathic distress plays a big role in emotional exhaustion. The other one is emotional suppression, or what is called depersonalization. So instead of connecting at the human level, you choose to switch off that human connection and turn the, for example, if you're a doctor, you turn the patient into a number, patients in room number X. Okay, and that's you switch off the human connection and you turn the person into a kind of a depersonalize it, and it turns out that is actually yet another factor for burnout. And the third one is a sense of powerlessness. Now, the sense of powerlessness is a bit more complicated, especially systems are involved, but at least in the emotional exhaustion and depersonalization, we can do something about it. And particularly like those in the caring profession, and I would include here teachers of the primary school teachers as well. I mean, they are constantly dealing with, crying kids. I think just, learning a bit about this empathy, compassion distinction and finding a way to constructively regulate one's empathy, all of this is going to really give you greater resilience so that you can continue to take joy in the work that you love to do anyway.
I love that. Thank you. And I feel motivated now to turn back to this amazing community and ask all of you another question, actually. So one thing I think I've heard from both of you is that this comes from sort of paying a bit more attention, and rather than shutting away the sources of overwhelm or the suffering we see around us, tuning into it and bringing a sense of compassion towards it. So my question, I guess, off the back of what you've both shared to the community here is, where would you like to bring more compassion or see more compassion or bring a sort of compassionate sort of sense towards in the world? What are the issues in your local community, in your country, in your outlook on the world that you may have been feeling overwhelmed by, but actually what you really want to bring is a sense of compassion towards? So I'm saying, policy making, healthcare, homelessness, politics, the elderly, mental health, the media, addiction, gun violence, refugees, racism, asylum seekers, animal welfare, climate change, vulnerability generally, lack of parenting skills, climate justice, poverty, vaccine issues, inequality, people living with dementia, disaffected youth, and many more that are flying past. So maybe let's just take a moment to pause and notice how much compassion has just been shared there. That's a real sense of what I'm feeling, although I'm only seeing words on the screen. I'm feeling not only are these issues that we care about, but this is a a real desire to help people in those situations. And I think that's a beautiful thing. Maybe we could explore some of those together then. So, I mean, one thing that was mentioned a few times there was climate. And I guess one of the challenges with an issue, it sort of makes me feel the way Alex described so beautifully, sort of really hopeless and a bit overwhelmed. I mean, I actually spent quite a lot of time working in climate change related issues prior to getting involved with Action for Happiness. One of the reasons I really care about helping people realize that a happier world doesn't involve having more stuff and flying more and consuming more is because I think that's one of the paths to a more sustainable way of living. But climate change can feel utterly unfair in terms of the people most affected are those least responsible. It can feel really hopeless as a parent of kids and thinking about them and then their children and thinking, what kind of world are we leaving them? It's sort of terrifying, actually. So how can we use what you've both shared to respond in a helpful way, as you said, Jinpa, to something as big as climate change?
I'll let Alex to jump in first as the activist here.
Oh, thanks, Jinpa. Yeah, gosh. Well, Jinpa's invited me to share as an activist, which to some extent is true. I do take part in actions that are designed to kind of stimulate government response, but they're about more than that. They are about, I've been taking part since the very beginning of Extinction Rebellion in various actions in London and supporting the kind of infrastructure to develop something they call regenerative culture. And for me, what's most interesting about that is that activism is not just a way of kind of forcing change to happen. It's also a way of breaking open a new space in which an alternative way of being can be offered to the world. So I'm particularly kind of inspired by what activism offers to people in ways of connecting with others who have this shared experience and feeling, and providing a sense of this agency that Jinpa mentioned is one of the things that when you don't have that, when you don't have a way that you can act, this is one of the things that can really kind of burn us out. So finding small ways that we can participate in action can be hugely, hugely helpful. But I'm going to take the liberty of making one other small point. I saw a couple of people wanting to bring in other emotions into this conversation. I saw someone say that their activism is motivated by anger, and I saw someone else say, what about joy? And I think there's a really interesting development we can take on what Jinpa was saying about cherishing our capacity for empathy. You know, if we allow our fear of climate change or our resistance to the situation of the world to close down our hearts, we can't selectively numb emotions. I remember picking that up from Brene Brown. So what happens when we try to numb out that fear is we actually are also numbing out all of the rest of the emotions that we feel as well, including that capacity for kind of empathy and care. And so we're becoming perhaps temporarily safer in the sense that we're not exposed to some of those feelings we find threatening, but we're also cutting ourselves off from that kind of organic lifeblood of what it means to be a human being. And I'm particularly interested in how this combination of compassion practice and taking compassionate action in the world can actually open us up to a fuller and richer experience of all of our emotions, and they can all play a really valuable role. There is a healthy and a viable form of anger. Anger isn't just something destructive that needs to be cast away. There's a way in which that can be channeled that is non-violent, that is highly motivating, and that is directed and focused towards change. You know, these emotions all have their role to play. So I'm in favor of greater emotional experience and fluency, but also a skillfulness that needs to be cultivated in order for that to come about.
Well, actually, thank you, Alex. That's incredibly wise. And I love that phrase, well, that word, skillfulness. And maybe that's what I might come back to Jinpa with, which is rather than diving into more of these big, sort of slightly overwhelming issues, actually, what are some of the skills that we can cultivate to help us here? Are there any particular practices from a meditation perspective or in terms of tools that we could share with people that would help them be able to have a bit more of that clarity and that ability to sort of respond wisely and helpfully?
I mean, let me go back to the issue of climate crisis, because that for me right now is one of the things that really occupies my mind. Partly because recently I had the privilege to translate for His Holiness in a historic kind of encounter between a conversation between His Holiness and the climate activist Greta Thunberg. And I have personally been a huge admirer of Greta Thunberg. My two girls are, a little bit older than her. One is 22, one is 24, and they have been great admirers of Greta Thunberg. And part of that journey of culminating in that dialogue was preparation. And we had a group of scientists who were particularly focused on the concept of feedback loops. And the reason why I bring this up is because sometimes when we think about climate crisis, we get totally overwhelmed. And we think that unless all the world governments come together and do something, we as individuals can't do anything. And there's an element of truth there, because in the end, the challenge transcends any national boundaries. So it is, unless there is a top-down governmental, intergovernmental, and international approach, in the end, we're not going to solve the problem. But I think it needs to be a two-pronged approach. I think at the individual, I think each of us can do something. We can moderate our behavior from excessive consumerism to something asking a simple question: do I really need this? And it's just being conscious about our lifestyle, our driving habits, and all the rest. And I am guilty as charged. And until the pandemic hit, I was traveling quite extensively. And now with the pandemic, all of a sudden I realized actually 50% of those travels were probably not essential. And imagine the carbon footprint. So these are, and we learn as individuals, because all of us have blind spots. But I think with climate crisis, the responsibility falls both on us as individuals. And also it is important to constantly inspire ourselves. I mean, I was recently watching BBC News. There was this amazing story of one individual who is introducing urban forest in Karachi, a city of 16 million people. And he has been buying these deserted old factory sites and planting urban forest. And in those forests, there's a difference of 6 degrees in the heat, at the height of the summer heat. So those are beautiful stories. So there are ways in which each of us can do. And in the end, I don't think we have the luxury to give up. I mean, because this is an existential crisis, but we should not really sort of wallow ourselves into self-pity and, fatalism. I think at the same time, we need to be realistic. And one beautiful thing about the concept of feedback loop is that we don't need to solve all the problems. We just need to help nature get to a point where the cycle could be reversed. That's all it needs. And then there is a virtuous cycle that kicks in. So if we understand that, it feels less enormous, because we're just, we turn our nature into our ally, so that we help nature wherever we can by, nudging it toward the direction where the cycle could be turned in the opposite direction. And then things will start to happen. So I think those are really, sort of important considerations, because I don't think when it comes to climate crisis, no one has an exception. I think everybody needs to take responsibility. I don't think, any single human being can say, that's not my problem. Even if you don't have kids, you cannot say that's not my problem. So,
thank you. That's very wise, and I fully agree. I'm conscious of time, and I want to get to some of the wonderful questions that people have been asking. And thank you for all of your contributions, both on the chat and in the Q&A. Actually, the first question I wanted to bring in was something that came from the chat earlier, and I think I remember the name being Steve. Apologies if I got that wrong. But the question was along the lines of, it's quite easy to be compassionate to people who are like us. Often we find it harder to people who we see as the enemy, the outgroup, the other in some way. Alex, how are you finding your response to people, you mentioned someone in the chat had observed anger. I think we often feel anger towards people we think of as being morally unjust in some way, but how do we bring compassion to people who might be seen as not on our side?
You know what, Mark, I'm going to do the same thing Jinpa did and say I think Jinpa will have a wonderful answer to this question, and I'll bring in another point afterwards.
Well, it is true that we tend to have easier time sort of extending compassion to the people that we love, people that we care, people who look like us, that people we can identify with. But having said that, we also know that even in the context of someone that we don't know at all, a total stranger, if the suffering involved is really acute, like someone being knocked down by a car and bleeding, then we really cut through that problem of identification and we connect directly with the person. That's because suffering is a powerful connector. So we do have a capacity to cut through all that, divisions that we create by our mind and just cut to the chase and connect compassionately. But generally, yes, that's why I think in Buddhist thought, we bring two other things alongside the concept of compassion. One is wisdom. So wisdom is not a really nice word here, but it's more like a kind of an understanding or insight. The other one is skillfulness or skillful means. So insight and understanding is necessary for us to expand our capacity for empathy, because at the heart of compassion is the ability to identify with that other person. If our consciousness of differences, if our consciousness of what the other person has done to me, sense of grievance, comes in the way of not being able to identify with that other person, we're not going to have compassion. So there, I think you need understanding. And in today's, time when society is all over the world, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, there are a lot of social justice movement who are calling upon everyone to wake up and pay attention to the oppressed. There has been, systemic biases, systemic injustices, systemic structures that have been very harsh and have served as blind spots. So in those contexts, for those who are not members of that community, oppressed community, we need to bring understanding. If we don't understand where they're coming from, then we are not going to be able to identify with the call, what is needed, and then the compassion is not going to kick in. So insight and understanding plays a role in expanding our capacity and scope of empathy so that we can identify, and then the human response kicks in. But the skillful means is a more tricky one, because it's one thing to feel compassion. It is a completely different matter to how to translate that compassion into action. And there's no one action that is right. And the same compassion may need to be translated to different actions in different contexts. And that's where skillful means is important, because sometimes the most compassionate thing to do may be not to do anything. Because when you do something, it puts the other person in a very difficult position, so sometimes the best thing is not to do anything. So that how to translate compassion into action, then Buddhism brings up another concept, which is skillful means. And the skillful means require appreciation of the sensitivity to context, taking into account the differences of people involved, and bringing more awareness to your own baggage to the situation. Because sometimes we charge in, say, I feel compassion. My job is just to do for me, authenticity is the most important thing. I don't care what the result is. So sometimes we charge in and it causes more harm than good.
I really love this point.
Yeah,
I really love this point, Jinpa, and I think the wisdom of knowing when to not respond. And I think sometimes when I feel a sense of anger, actually the best thing I've learned is to take a breath and to come back to it a bit later when I've had a chance to process it a bit, rather than reacting in the spur of the moment. Alex, you were going to make another point as well.
Yeah, just this sort of insight element that Jinpa was talking about, one that is taught really clearly in the course that Jinpa was the author of, the compassion cultivation training, which I was very lucky to get a place on some years ago. One of the things that's really clear that I think relates to this common humanity piece is this insight that's very that's expressed a lot in Buddhism, but which is this idea that we are all seeking happiness and we're all seeking to avoid suffering. This is the sort of great unifier of what it means to be a human being. In terms of how this impacts the way we relate to others, though, I think there's an aspect of needing to deepen our relationship with ourselves. If the way that we relate to ourselves is primarily filtered through my nation, the football team that I support, the groups that I am part of, the groups that I'm not part of, if our self-identification is based at that level, then our relationship to others is as others. But if one of the things I've been privileged to experience a little bit in meditation practice is that you drop into deeper and deeper experiences of self. And as you go into those, you actually become closer and closer to not just all other people, but other living beings. You know, the bird that lives in the tree outside my window just as much wants to be happy and free from suffering as I do. And I find that really encouraging as a way that we're not trying to get over the barriers between us. We just need to drop down into a root network in which we're already all connected.
That's a beautiful point. Thank you. I would love to come to another, I think, related question, actually, from Sadan, I think is how you pronounce it. Sorry if I've got that wrong. And they're asking, how can we maintain a sense of compassion for others when we're overwhelmed with our existing responsibilities and demands? And I feel here that maybe we want to bring in the idea of self-compassion, because actually many of us do a lot for others and are actually really harsh on ourselves, and that perhaps undermines our ability to be helpful and really compassionate. What are your thoughts, both of you, on this idea of, you know, when feeling that life's too busy, how do you make space for compassion?
Well, that's actually a universal experience that shared by all of us, particularly in today's very fast-paced modern life, juggling so many things at the same time and feeling as if constantly you are chasing time. But I would still say that the paradox of compassion is that even though common sense says that when you allow your compassion to express, because you are making fuss about someone else's suffering, you are bringing an additional suffering on top of what all the struggles that you yourself have. But the paradox is, in some sense, by doing that, we are creating a more spaciousness for our own relationship with our own problems and sufferings. Because sometimes, you know, when we are caught up in our own suffering, we're too close to the experience and it seems enormous, unbearable, like it just tends to take over our mind. And one of the interesting things about suffering and pain is that once you notice it, it just hijacks your attention. And that's generally how suffering and pain works. But the moment you are able to think about others' problem, it creates more space. And in that space, your own relationship with your own suffering actually changes. So I would argue that even though, you know, you yourself are constantly juggling with your own problems and suffering, the more you are able to create space for problems of people in your own life, you will begin to notice that the intensity of the experience of your own suffering will change. You will have a kind of a more spacious relationship with your own suffering.
That's really wise, Jinpa. Thank you. And actually, rather than asking Alex to comment on that same question, because I think you've covered that so well, I'd love to actually bring this one to you, Alex, from Nadine. Many people in the chat have been really moved by what you said earlier about your own experience of feeling overwhelmed by the moral injury and the distress fatigue and so on. Nadine's just asked, can you walk us through what moving towards compassion or regulating empathy looks like when you're feeling that sense of overwhelm? What does a healthy response look like, specifically when world events feel outside of our control? How have you found helpful ways to deal with that, Alex?
Wow, what an amazing question. What I love about this question is that I was triggered by another question that came up in the chat. Someone said, "What about courage?" And I was like, "Gosh, we should use that word at some point." So I'll try and use it. I'll try and use it now. Think, how do we manifest the courage to turn to face events that seem extremely threatening? For me, I'm really blessed to have been kind of gifted what we can call a mindfulness practice, but I think even that is slightly sort of exaggerating what I really do. The reality is I somewhere along the line picked up from someone that it might be a good idea if, when things are difficult, I pause and take a breath. That actually, for me, the experience of suffering itself is a kind of a bell that I can use as a moment to kind of wake up a little bit. And what the experience of breathing does for me, or pausing and coming back to the breath, is really opens up that space. This is related perhaps a little bit with something that Jinpa's hugely familiar with, but the practice in the Tibetan tradition of Tonglen. But I find myself when there is suffering coming up, whether that's something interpersonal or even up to this like sort of bigger scale that we're talking about in this question, actually the opportunity to recognize it and to pause and to breathe it in, not to kind of witness it from a distance, but really to kind of draw it into myself. This is really the courage that we're talking about. This is a perhaps quite a frightening experience, but it's one that is accompanied for me by the faith that is born of having done that before, which is that as that comes into me, there's something transformative that happens. There's a kind of reconnecting where I'm taken out of my head and down into more of the space of the heart. And then as I breathe out, I'm breathing out from that heart place. This is the kind of manifestation of that wish. So this, we've talked about compassion in many different forms in this conversation, and I'm particularly inspired by compassionate action, of course, but to have a kind of practice that we can do on the spot when suffering is so manifest, that can kind of redirect where the energy of that goes, I find hugely helpful. And even more so, it's a practice. And especially when I see, the situation with the decision to start turning away refugee boats as they're washing up on our shores and putting those people at risk, and the feelings of kind of rage and despair that manifest in me, actually, if I can say with that and I can breathe with that, I can realize that an even bigger feeling is my feeling of care towards those people, and how lucky I am to be filled with so much care and to want to be of help. And that really is what's going to fuel my positive action rather than the feelings of despair.
And that is that form of courage, which I think brings us nicely back to the theme of this event. And I'm afraid we're rapidly running out of time. So we've got a perfect question that's upvoted to the top of the list here to leave us with this evening, because someone's just asked, what is Jinpa's Center that was mentioned, and where is Alex doing this studying and work that you're doing in compassion? So I'd love to just turn to each of you and share a little bit more about where people can find out more, because I know in your case, Jinpa, there's a course that people could potentially find out more about, and Alex, I know you've got a special offer that you'd maybe like to open out to this audience, so please do stay tuned, folks. Jinpa, firstly, what is your center and what's this course?
The center is called Compassion Institute, and it's based in California. It's an offshoot from the work that I did at Stanford, the CK that Alex was mentioning. And it's set up specifically to really explore ways in which compassion-based approaches can begin to be applied to key sectors of the society. So, for example, we have projects on bringing compassion-based techniques for dealing with the burnout among physicians in the healthcare setting. And we're working closely with the University of California, San Diego Health Sciences School, and similarly, we have another project which is to bring compassion-based approaches to law enforcement and justice, especially for policing. And this is again in California. And the aim is to really, the premise upon all of this is that if we can tap into compassion as a powerful motive, and also underpinned by emphasis on relating to others at the fundamental level that Alex was talking about, the shared humanity, then the response on the part of the physicians and the law enforcement officers will be different. So, so that is and then we have a similar education program as well. So compassioninstitute.com is the website, and the course that Mark, you were referring to is a 6-part, quite a comprehensive introductory self-paced course that I developed, which is being delivered through Compassion Institute right now. It's a cohort-based system. It takes 2 weeks, 6 courses, classes, spread over 2 weeks, a cohort of 300 people at a time, who can then create a sense of community and dialogue and blogging and so on, with culminating with an hour-and-a-half Q&A with me live. So that's it's been in, it's been running for about the last 2 months, and it's still open. I think a lot of people might actually find that helpful, and we have consciously priced the attendance so that affordability doesn't become a major barrier. So there are 3 levels of price you can choose to pay yourself, and so I recommend people to take a look there. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jinpa, and we'll make sure we include a link to that in the follow-up email that will go out to everyone who's been involved in this event tomorrow. But just to finish, thank you, Jinpa. It's lovely to know that exists, and thank you for all the amazing work you're doing in the world. Alex, anything more you wanted to say, both about the study and the journey you've been on, but particularly I know you've got an offer you'd like to share with everyone this evening as well?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Well, first of all, I must recommend to all of you this book. I wouldn't do this just for anyone, but genuinely, this is going to be in one of my top five favorite books for life. I think Jinpa has done such an amazing work of getting across some of the ideas that we've talked about in this, and kind of rereading it for this call reminded me how beautifully you've woven together the experiences of your life, the science, in such an accessible way. So this book is called A Fearless Heart, and I really recommend it to all of you. In terms of my offer, you've all been taking part in something that's very important to me. This talk has been part of the sort of capstone of this project I've been doing for the last year at CCARE, which is about applied compassion and looking at how we can kind of explain compassion in a way that it helps us to manage and relate to global suffering and the situation that we are experiencing. Part of that project has been doing public talks like this, but part of it has been one-on-one conversations. And so it's really nourishing for me to connect with people that are, at all different levels interested in this topic of compassion and how we relate to global suffering. So I think perhaps I can drop something in the chat, which is a little form you can fill in if you'd like to have a one-on-one conversation with me. I'm going to offer a full day, so 24 1-hour slots for people to speak to me. It would be an absolute delight to speak with you. So thank you so much.
That's now in the chat, I think, folks. There's a bit.ly link for Compassion Courage. Alex is the link, and so if you'd like to take up Alex on that, very generous offer, Alex, to sort of spend a bit of time one-to-one exploring some of these things further. I know that your personal story has really resonated with people today, so hopefully some of them will be able to take that up. We're out of time. This has been a fantastic session. I've learned a lot, and I feel very moved by both of your contributions. Jinpa, thank you so much for making time from across the other side of the world and for all of the amazing work you've shared with us today, but that you've been doing for many years. It's a real inspiration. Alex, thank you for bringing this to life in such a rich and sort of personal way. I'd like to invite you both to say maybe in a sentence, one final thought to leave us with as we part today. Alex.
All the world's systems are made of people, and if we practice opening our hearts, we can open the hearts of others and change the way all things are done.
Lovely. Jinpa.
Well, what I would like to share with everybody is that compassion is a resource that we all possess naturally in all of us. And by paying attention to it and trying to create space for it so that it can be more active force in our everyday life, will really change not just ourselves, but actually the quality of our interaction with the world.
Well said. Thank you both so much. And thank you to everyone who's been part of this event today, wherever you are in the world. Let's keep bringing that compassionate action to help make this world happier. Thank you all.